At the farthest stretch of the county road, where the dust thickened and the hedges grew wild, stood a farmhouse that seemed older than memory itself. The Turner house was not grand, nor crumbling, but steady in its silence. The white paint, once bright, had dulled to a pale gray that never caught the sun. The shutters stayed closed most of the year, and even when light poured down across the fields, the house seemed reluctant to reveal what it carried inside. To passers-by, it looked like any farm of modest means, a place where soil-fed families and life moved by the rhythms of planting and harvest. Yet the stillness was not the stillness of peace. It was the stillness of waiting. The Turner family had long been spoken of with respect. Thomas Turner, broad-shouldered and quiet, was seen as a man of responsibility. His wife, Hannah, gentle in her voice and manner, was admired for her devotion to children. They were the ones people turned to when unwanted infants were born, when widows could not keep another mouth alive, when the county orphan list grew too long for the parish to manage. People said the Turners had room, and more importantly, they had kindness. A wagon was often seen moving slowly up the lane, carrying small bundles of human life, wrapped in thin blankets, each one vanishing behind the farm gates. Parents who gave up their children walked back into town lighter with relief, their neighbors patting their shoulders, saying they had done the right thing. After all, the Turner house was known for charity. It was spoken of as if heaven had planted it at the edge of those fields for that very purpose. But the truth of a house is never told by its walls or its roof. It is told by what does not leave it. And no child taken in by the Turners was ever seen again in the county. Not in school records, not at Sunday service, not even in the fields at play. The town explained this away with simple answers. Perhaps the children were frail. Perhaps they were sent to distant relatives. Perhaps the Turners were private and protective. People did not want to ask further, because to ask would be to suggest that kindness could be counterfeit. And such a thought was too heavy for the simple minds of the county. Inside the farmhouse, however, charity was only a mask. Behind the shutters, the air was thick with an odor that did not belong to food or farming. It was metallic and damp, a scent that clung to floorboards and fabric. At night, when the wind shifted, faint cries sometimes drifted across the fields, too distant to carry shape, too fleeting for anyone to claim with certainty. Dogs in nearby farms often grew restless, their ears pricked toward the Turner property, their bodies trembling in ways that suggested something unnatural had settled in the soil. Thomas Turner believed himself not a farmer of crops, but a farmer of souls. He kept ledgers not of wheat or livestock, but of children, recording each arrival with a careful hand. He spoke little in public, but within his home his silence was a form of rule. The walls absorbed his order. Hannah, with her soft face and folded hands, carried out his expectations without tremor. Together they fashioned their reputation like a cloak, shielding what lay beneath. What made the house most disturbing was how ordinary it seemed. The hearth burned, the table was laid, the rocking chair creaked as if in rhythm with the seasons. Nothing in its outer shell betrayed the truth, yet within its cellar, doors heavier than needed for storage waited to close against the cries of children. Windows were absent where they should have been, as though the house had grown its own defenses against daylight. Those who came to the Turner farm with offerings of children never asked to see inside. They never asked why the children never came out. Gratitude clouded their sight, and relief dulled their suspicions. Evil did not need to hide in darkness. It simply stood where no one wished to look. And so the Turner house at the edge of the field stood quietly year after year, swallowing life under the disguise of kindness. A place where innocence was delivered with trust and where nothing ever returned. The shutters remained closed, the ledgers filled, and the fields grew tall with each passing summer. But the soil surrounding the house, though it carried crops, carried something else beneath. And while the county praised the Turners for their generosity, the house itself seemed to lean closer to the earth with each year, as though burdened by the weight of secrets pressing up from its foundations. In silence, in secrecy, the house became less a home and more a vessel. It was not just a place where children disappeared. It was a place where something darker than hunger, darker than cruelty had begun to take root. The Turner farm waited patiently, as if it knew that trust would always bring another child through its gates. And as the fields swayed in the wind, the house stood immovable, a monument not to mercy, but to the first step in a story too vast, too horrific, for the county to imagine. In every corner of the county, the Turner name carried the scent of decency. Thomas was spoken of as a man who worked hard, who never raised his voice in public, who bowed his head at prayer. Hannah was remembered as gentle, patient, and endlessly willing to open her door to children who had nowhere else to go. Their farm stood like a landmark of compassion, a refuge in a landscape where poverty often swallowed the weak. The townsfolk believed what they wanted to believe, that goodness lived at the edge of their fields, protecting the smallest and most vulnerable among them. In an age when life was fragile and death common, the Turners offered an illusion of safety. It was enough to keep questions silent. Each time a wagon brought another child up the rutted lane, the town praised the Turners more. Mothers who could not afford another mouth were comforted with words that their children would be cared for, raised in a home that valued prayer and discipline. Fathers who carried shame for abandoning a child found that shame softened when they spoke of the Turner house. Neighbors reassured them that their little one would not be cast out, but nurtured. In the marketplace and in the pews, people repeated the story of Turner charity until it hardened into fact. The truth, however, was that no one could name a single child who had grown into adulthood under the Turner roof. When Sunday came and bells called the county to worship, the pew where the Turner family sat was always the same. Thomas on the aisle, Hannah beside him, their faces sober with devotion. Yet no children sat with them. Not once did the townsfolk see a Turner orphan at the service. When school terms began, the records bore no Turner names, no Turner signatures. No child raised in that farmhouse played in the meadows. No Turner boy was seen with a fishing pole at the creek. No Turner girl gathered flowers along the hedges. It was as if each orphan taken into that house had been carried away by the wind itself. The silence should have raised suspicion, but suspicion is heavy, and heavy things are often set aside. People whispered that the children were perhaps too weak to attend church, too simple to be educated, or maybe that the Turners, cautious and devout, preferred to keep them at home. Rumors softened fear and disguised it as respect. To question the Turners was to question mercy, and in small towns mercy was not doubted. It was needed. The county's poor relied on the idea of Turner kindness like a pillar holding up the whole fragile order of their lives. If the pillar cracked, the weight of shame, guilt, and fear would collapse on them all. Behind the shutters of the farmhouse, however, kindness existed only in ledgers. Hannah Turner recorded each orphan's arrival in careful script, writing down names she would never speak again outside those walls. Once ink touched paper, the child became only a record, a proof for officials who needed to see accounts of charity. It was paperwork that kept the Turners safe. On paper, they were saints. On paper, they were guardians of dozens of nameless little souls. The county's poor relief office was satisfied with signatures and tallies. No one demanded to see the children in flesh. In this gap between record and reality, the Turner family built a kingdom of shadows. The Turners knew that kindness was not about actions but appearances. They opened their door only as far as the threshold, smiled as bundles of life were handed over, then shut the door and vanished into silence. Families returned to town with lighter hearts, believing they had given their children a chance. They never asked why no letters arrived, why no updates were sent, why no evidence of life remained. And when the years passed and those children should have become adults, no one searched for them. It was easier not to remember, easier to keep the story intact. Thus, the Turners thrived. Their reputation grew even as their secrets multiplied. The county praised them as pillars of morality, when in truth their morality was only a veil draped across horror. The kindness the town celebrated was a kindness that never touched a single child. It existed in speech, in gossip, in the comfort of those who had abandoned their own blood. The real children, the living flesh and breath, were locked away behind wood and stone, erased from the community that believed it was saved by Turner generosity. And so the Turners lived in plain sight, untouched, admired, never questioned. Their names rose in prayer, their deeds repeated in praise, while in truth their hands did not cradle life but smothered it. The town never saw the orphans again, not in laughter, not in sorrow, not in death. They simply ceased to exist. And the silence of their absence was covered over with the sound of hymns and the rustle of marketplace chatter, as if the county itself had agreed to forget. What appeared as kindness on the surface had already begun to rot beneath, waiting for the moment when silence could no longer protect it. Beneath the Turner farmhouse, the earth had been cut open and reshaped into something unnatural. At first glance, it looked like any root cellar, a place where potatoes, onions, and jars of preserves might wait for the winter months. But anyone who stepped beyond the first few feet would notice the wrongness in its design. The walls stretched too far, the ceilings arched too high, and the tunnels split into chambers that had no reason to exist in a simple farming household. The Turners had dug deeper than the land called for, deeper than the purpose of storing food required. What they built was not a cellar, but a hive for something darker. The air there carried a damp chill, heavy with the scent of mold and rust. Wooden steps creaked with each descent, and the deeper one went, the less the farmhouse above seemed to belong to the same world. The chambers opened like ribs branching from a spine, each one with a different character, a different cruelty waiting to be revealed. No one from town ever saw these places, but the children knew them. They were lowered into silence through a heavy door, their small feet touching earth that would never again feel the sun. One chamber was lined with stone walls, smoother than they should have been, as if scraped down by countless hands. This was the room of endurance, where children were left in darkness for days, their hunger measured, their screams absorbed by the rock until they weakened into silence. Another chamber had walls laced with strange vents, breathing faint drafts that carried whispers from other rooms. Here the children could hear each other but never see, each cry twisting into a distorted echo that made them believe they were surrounded by dozens when only a few suffered. The air itself became a weapon, filling lungs with dread more than breath. Deeper still lay a room that appeared almost ceremonial. Its dirt floor had been packed into hard patterns, circles etched into the soil by repeated footsteps. Chains hung from beams not in rows but in shapes, as if the Turners arranged them with design rather than utility. In this place, punishment was more than punishment. It was ritual. Children were positioned according to rules they could not understand, forced to kneel in ways that mimicked prayer but left their bodies twisted in pain. The Turners believed they were shaping order from chaos, turning disobedience into a ceremony that erased individuality. The strangest chamber was the one the children whispered of as the breathing room. Its walls were covered with wooden slats, leaving narrow spaces that let air shift in and out, almost in rhythm. At night, the sound resembled lungs pulling breath, as though the cellar itself lived. When the Turners placed children inside, the air seemed to press against their faces, suffocating them even as it allowed them to live. Some swore they could feel the walls expand and contract like the belly of a beast that had swallowed them whole. Many did not emerge. Those who did carried eyes wide and vacant, as though they had glimpsed something beyond cruelty, something not meant to be understood. For Thomas Turner, each chamber served a purpose. He called them classrooms in his ledger, lessons written not in chalk but in suffering. He believed the cellar transformed weakness into order, stripping away the self until only submission remained. Hannah moved among the rooms with calm hands, adjusting chains, pouring water into bowls, singing hymns that sounded like comfort but promised nothing but obedience. Together they shaped the cellar into a place where discipline and devotion blurred into torment. The farmhouse above continued to stand as a symbol of charity, its shutters closed against suspicion. But the ground beneath carried the truth, each chamber breathing in silence, each wall bearing the marks of children who were told they were being saved. The cellar was not in storage, it was not a shelter, it was a system, a ritual machine built to take innocence and grind it into something unrecognizable. In time, the earth itself seemed to adopt the weight of what had been done within it. The soil pressed dampness into the walls, dripping like sweat, as though even the land wished to breathe out the horrors it contained. Yet no breath escaped, no sound traveled beyond the heavy doors. Only the children heard it, only they knew that the cellar lived, and that its life was fed by their suffering. The county above went on with its prayers and its markets, blind to the truth that beneath their admired neighbor's home stretched a world designed to erase children room by room, until they became nothing more than silence. The cellar was not only a place of confinement, it was a theater of punishment, where Thomas and Hannah Turner perfected their methods of breaking children until no part of them remained whole. Each chamber carried its own logic, its own cruel philosophy disguised as discipline. What they devised went beyond beating or starvation. It was punishment transformed into ritual, sharpened into something deliberate, where suffering itself became the lesson. The glass chamber was the most disturbing. Its walls were lined with sheets of polished glass, salvaged and fitted together until the room became a box of reflection. A child placed inside could see themselves from every angle, fractured and multiplied, surrounded by faces that were their own but distorted. When they cried, the sound did not fade into distance. Instead, the echo hit back with crushing force, bouncing from surface to surface until a single scream became 1,000. The noise folded in on itself, swelling to a pitch that no mind could endure. A short cry became unbearable. A longer one broke the child's sense of self entirely. They screamed until they begged themselves to stop, until their own voice turned into a weapon against them. For Thomas, it was proof that identity could be dismantled with nothing but reflection and sound. In another chamber, silence itself was the law. The room was padded with thick layers of straw and cloth built to swallow every sound before it could escape. Here the children were told that to speak was to lose something they could never get back. Sharp blades hung in plain view, suspended from the rafters, a reminder of the punishment for breaking the rule. Hannah often sat outside the door, listening with a patience that was almost maternal. If a whisper slipped through, if a sob dared to break the air, she entered with calm movements and carried out mutilations so precise they seemed rehearsed. Fingers were sometimes taken, sometimes tongues. The children quickly learned that silence was not a request but a command sealed in flesh. The room became a place where fear grew in the absence of sound, where even breathing felt like a crime. The Turners convinced themselves that these punishments were not cruelty but refinement. Thomas wrote in his ledgers that the glass chamber revealed the sickness of pride, that children who cried too loudly were trapped by their own vanity. Hannah believed the silence chamber purified the spirit, stripping away sin through the absence of voice. Together they shaped these methods into a twisted kind of doctrine, one that clothed itself in discipline but stripped children of everything that made them human. The cruelty of the punishments was not just in the pain they caused, but in the way they stole meaning. A child in the glass chamber could no longer tell which face was theirs, which voice was their own. A child in the silence chamber forgot the sound of language, forgot even their own name, until identity dissolved into obedience. The Turners had created not just rooms of torment, but factories of erasure, where the individual was broken into fragments and then ground into nothing at all. What made these punishments more horrific was the calmness with which they were carried out. There was no rage, no frenzy. Thomas adjusted the glass walls with care, polishing them until they shone bright enough to multiply a single sob into endless terror. Hannah carried the blades into the silence chamber with the composure of a nurse tending to the sick. Their evil was not born of impulse but of method, a steady hand that turned cruelty into practice, practice into ritual. The children were not punished for misbehavior. They were punished because punishment itself was the purpose. And yet, above the cellar, life continued as if nothing were amiss. The farmhouse still smelled of bread baking. The fields still grew tall with corn. The Turners still greeted neighbors with nods of respect. No one beyond those walls could imagine that beneath their feet, children were staring into mirrors that shattered their minds, or holding their breath in silence that threatened to steal their bodies. The punishments remained hidden, but their echoes lingered in the soil, in the walls, in the very air of the house. The cellar did not just confine children, it absorbed their screams, their silences, their mutilations, until it seemed the chambers themselves carried memory. And though the county saw only charity in the Turner family, what truly lived at the edge of those fields was cruelty perfected into ritual, a cruelty that grew stronger with each punishment carried out in silence and glass. In the upstairs room of the Turner farmhouse, beneath the sloped ceiling where dust thickened in the rafters, Thomas Turner kept his books. They were not the records of crops or debts that other farmers kept, but volumes bound in worn leather, their pages filled with handwriting so small and neat it seemed mechanical. Each book was marked only with a number on the spine, giving no hint of its contents. To the casual eye, they looked like any account books, but to Thomas they were something far greater. These ledgers were the history of his work, the proof of his order, the science of his cruelty. Inside, every page was divided into columns, and in those columns he recorded the details of children as if they were experiments. He assigned numbers instead of names, stripping away identity at the moment of entry. Age, weight, and condition were noted with care, followed by observations of behavior. How long they cried, how quickly they obeyed, what signs of defiance remained. Then came the experiments themselves, listed like trials. The time spent in the glass chamber, the duration of silence endured before the first whisper, the length of starvation before collapse. Each line was cold, efficient, without emotion. To Thomas, these were not horrors. They were data. He believed suffering revealed the truth. In his mind, pain was a language, and his duty was to record its grammar. A child who screamed after an hour was weaker than one who held silent for 2. A child who broke after 3 days of hunger had less spirit than one who endured 4. These measurements, logged with ruthless precision, became the framework for his philosophy. He was not merely harming children, he was charting them, reducing their existence into numbers he could compare, patterns he could study. To him, this was not murder but research. On some pages he drew diagrams, small sketches of restraints or positions he devised. He measured how long the body could endure inversion before the lungs drowned in their own fluids. He timed the heartbeats of children left in the breathing chamber, noting how the sound of air shifting through the walls altered their rhythms. When death came, it was not written as a tragedy, but as a conclusion. Specimen 14 expired after 72 hours without sound, failure of breath. Specimen 23 expired under inversion at 5 hours, 47 minutes. The words were written with a steadiness that betrayed no pause, no remorse. Death was not the end of a child to him. It was the completion of a line in his ledger. The most haunting detail was how Thomas treated the process with reverence. He sharpened his quills before each entry, smoothed the ink so no blot marred the page. His handwriting never shook, not even when recording the last moments of life. The neatness itself became a kind of ritual, a ceremony of control. He believed the ledgers would outlive him, that they were scripture of a new order where children were no longer souls but specimens. Their suffering transformed into knowledge. Hannah assisted in her way, though she never touched the books. She brought the ink, she carried the lamps, she placed the journals back on the shelves when Thomas finished. Her silence gave approval. Together they built not just a cellar of torment but an archive of it, a library hidden in plain sight beneath the roof of a farmhouse praised for its charity. If the county had known, if any neighbor had opened those books, they would have seen not just proof of murder, but evidence of something even more chilling. Calculation. These were not impulsive acts, not the madness of sudden cruelty, but the methodical dismantling of life, written with the same order used to count bushels of grain or tally livestock. Each child who vanished into the Turner house was reduced to ink on a page, their humanity erased by the stroke of a pen. At night, when the fields outside swayed in the wind and the house seemed to rest, Thomas would sit with his ledgers open, running his finger down the lines as if reviewing sacred text. He convinced himself he was uncovering laws hidden in flesh, truths about obedience, endurance, and control. In his mind, he was not a farmer at all, but a scholar of suffering, a man who had found wisdom in the cries of orphans no one would miss. And as the candles burned low, he wrote on, recording each breath that faltered, each body that failed, until the ledgers themselves became monuments of absence, holding the only trace of children who otherwise ceased to exist. Behind the Turner farmhouse, the land stretched into neat rows of apple trees, their branches thick with fruit that seemed to glow against the horizon. Neighbors often spoke of the orchard as a marvel, its blossoms heavier, its harvest richer than any in the county. The soil there was said to be fertile, blessed by God, and the Turners were praised for tending it so well. But the truth of that orchard was not sunlight, nor rainfall, nor the hand of providence. Its strength came from something buried far deeper, something the county would never dare to imagine. Beneath the roots lay pits dug with the same precision Thomas Turner used in every part of his life. These were not graves in the ordinary sense, not resting places for the dead, but arrangements. Each pit was carved into shape, its edges smoothed, its depth exact, as if mapped for a purpose beyond disposal. When the children who vanished from the cellar were no longer of use, their bodies were carried into the orchard. There, under the cover of night, the Turners lowered them into the earth. Yet they were not laid down with dignity or with the simple aim of hiding. They were placed as if to form a message written in flesh. Some bodies were bound together in pairs, their arms twisted across one another as though locked in an embrace that mocked love. Others were bent backwards, their spines arched until their bones cracked, creating circles that resembled symbols more than human remains. Hands were positioned toward the roots of the trees as if feeding them, while faces were turned upward toward the soil above, as though the dead were watching the orchard grow. Hannah sometimes murmured prayers during these burials, words that mixed devotion with cruelty, promising that sacrifice would give life to the land. The orchard became not just a field of trees, but a garden of ritual, each harvest fertilized by bones. Thomas kept notes even here. In his ledgers he recorded which trees stood above which pits, as if to compare their growth. He measured the weight of fruit, the sweetness of flesh, the abundance of blossoms, as though the orchard itself were part of his experiment. When certain trees thrived more than others, he marked it as proof that the arrangements mattered, that the way he bent and bound the bodies shaped the fertility of the soil. What the county praised as a miracle of farming was, in his eyes, confirmation that his methods carried power. By day, the orchard looked innocent, even beautiful. Sunlight scattered through leaves, bees moved from blossom to blossom, and children passing on distant lanes sometimes reached through fences to steal the fruit. But by night, when the moonlight cut across the rows, the ground seemed restless. The earth sagged slightly where pits had been dug, the soil sinking as if unwilling to hold what had been forced into it. Foxes and dogs were often found circling the edges, whining, their bodies stiff with unease. Some farmers said the turners had a secret fertilizer, some blend that drew such richness from the ground. They were not wrong, though none would have spoken the truth aloud even if they had guessed it. Hannah often walked among the trees with quiet pride, her apron brushing the branches heavy with fruit. To her, the orchard was proof of righteousness. She told herself that the children had not been wasted, that their suffering had been transformed into abundance. Each apple that grew was a sign of divine order, each blossom a reward for obedience. She carried baskets filled with fruit into town, offering them as gifts, their sweetness praised without question. No one who bit into them imagined they carried the taste of soil steeped in bones. The orchard became a shield for the turners, a visible symbol of their virtue. While townsfolk marveled at the richness of their harvest, the truth lay just inches beneath the surface, sealed away in silence. The pits multiplied year by year, the roots thickened, the branches spread. The bodies below decomposed, their bones locking together with roots until tree and child became indistinguishable. And as the seasons passed, the orchard stood taller, greener, and more vibrant, as though it thrived not in spite of death, but because of it. What the county called a blessing was, in truth, a burial ground, an orchard of bones that grew lush from sacrifice. It stood as the quiet proof of how far the turners' cruelty reached, how even the soil itself was turned into a partner in their ritual. And while the townsfolk praised the sweetness of the fruit, the earth beneath their feet was whispering a story of hunger that could never be sated. In the Turner household, hunger was not a punishment of chance nor the result of poverty. It was a weapon sharpened into ritual. Hannah Turner, who the county praised for her gentle manners and soft voice, had perfected the practice of withholding food until it became a ceremony. To her, starvation was not neglect, it was devotion. She carried it out with the calm precision of one convinced she was saving souls. Children were led into chambers where bowls were placed before them, not with meals but with empty vessels. Each day the bowls remained empty, their promise unfulfilled. Hannah would kneel before the children, folding her hands, whispering prayers that promised redemption. She told them that hunger was proof of their spirit being cleansed, that emptiness in the stomach was the path to fullness in heaven. Her words were repeated like scripture, spoken as their bodies withered. The ritual made starvation appear sacred, transforming cruelty into a perverse form of worship. The prayers themselves were crafted with care. Hannah recited them slowly in rhythm with the children's weakening breath. She prayed that each hollowed rib would be an offering, that each parched tongue would be a hymn, that each failing heartbeat would rise like incense to God. The prayers were not comfort but chains, binding the children to the belief that their suffering had meaning. Even as their bodies shrank, their bones pressing against skin, she convinced them that their pain was a gift, that their deaths were not losses but victories. To resist was to reject salvation. To die quietly was to prove devotion. Days blurred into nights and nights back into days. The children grew too weak to stand, their eyes too heavy to open. Hannah sat beside them, her hands always folded, her lips always moving. When a child begged for water, she lifted the bowl, tilted it as though to pour, and then withdrew it again, whispering that thirst was the voice of heaven calling them closer. When one cried out in desperation, she pressed her palm gently over their lips, commanding silence, reminding them that their voices should rise only in prayer, not in protest. Her gentleness made the cruelty worse. It was not the rage of a tyrant, but the calm insistence of a mother who believed she was guiding her children toward grace. Thomas recorded each death in his ledgers with the same detachment as always. But it was Hannah who gave the deaths their ritual form. For her, each child was a lamb offered on an altar invisible to the world. She did not see herself as cruel, but as chosen, the vessel through which discipline became holiness. Her prayers were not requests, but affirmations, as though God himself required these children to starve in his name. The cellar echoed with her voice, soft and steady, even as the cries of children grew weaker until only her words remained. What made the ritual most haunting was the way it turned life against itself. Hunger gnawed not just at the body, but at the mind. Children began to pray with her, repeating her words even as their lips cracked and their throats dried. They asked for forgiveness, begged for salvation, not knowing that the salvation they sought was only death. Their final breaths often carried fragments of Hannah's prayers, their voices faint echoes of her own, as though she had succeeded in remaking them in her image before they slipped into silence. The orchard outside grew heavy with fruit. The fields stood tall. The farmhouse looked as ordinary as ever. To the county, the Turners remained models of virtue. But within their home, starvation had become a liturgy, prayer a method of erasure, and Hannah a priestess of absence. She hallowed children not by rage but by devotion, stripping them of life with the same calm she used to knead bread or mend clothing. Her hands never shook, her voice never wavered. And when the bodies were carried away, she whispered one final prayer over them, thanking heaven for receiving another offering. The children did not die forgotten. They died as part of a ritual that demanded their flesh as proof of obedience. And in the stillness that followed each death, the house itself seemed to tighten, as if the walls had absorbed the prayers along with the cries, keeping them trapped beneath its roof. The county praised the Turners as saints, never knowing that their sanctity was built on starvation, that their kindness was a mask for a ritual in which every empty bowl was an altar and every silent child a sacrifice. Deeper than the breathing room, past the walls that sweated with damp, there was a chamber unlike any other. It was smaller than the rest, yet it carried the heaviest sense of design, as if every inch had been carved for one purpose alone. The Turners called it the Chamber of Reversal. To anyone else it would have looked like a space warped by madness, but to Thomas it was a place of order, the correction of what he called the flaw of nature. The ceiling was lined with iron hooks, the floor with shackles. Here children were bound not in the upright posture of living bodies, but inverted, suspended by their ankles until their faces turned dark and swollen. Thomas believed that the natural state of the human form was disobedient, tilted toward corruption. By reversing the body, he told himself, he was draining sin back into the earth, cleansing the child of the poison they carried. In reality, it was a slow dismantling of flesh, a methodical destruction masked in the logic of ritual. The children who entered the chamber felt the world tilt against them. The blood rushed to their heads until vision blurred, until their own breath became a weight pressing downward into their chests. At first they cried out, their arms reaching into the emptiness below as if to grasp ground that no longer belonged to them. But soon their voices cracked, their lungs struggled, and their bodies trembled with the effort of surviving what could not be survived. Their faces darkened to a shade between purple and black, their eyes swollen and wet, the vessels within them bursting one by one. Thomas stood with his ledger in hand, counting minutes, recording the precise moment when panic became silence, when silence became stillness. Some children lasted hours, their small frames twitching in desperate resistance. Others gave way quickly, their bodies too fragile to endure the reversal. He wrote their times as though timing a crop harvest, each failure a number added to his growing archive of suffering. He described their deaths not as endings, but as corrections of disorder, as if the breaking of their organs was the straightening of a crooked line. Hannah moved through the chamber with her own form of ceremony. She whispered prayers while fastening shackles, her hands steady, her eyes without expression. To her, the chamber was a place where the body was offered to heaven in reverse, where life was drained like a vessel turned upside down. She sometimes pressed her fingers to the foreheads of the inverted children, telling them they were closer to God now that the world had been flipped. Her calmness wrapped the horror in a cloak of devotion, making it feel less like torment and more like ritual sacrifice. The walls of the chamber carried stains that no amount of scrubbing could erase. Blood seeped downward from noses and mouths, soaking into the floor until the stone itself bore witness to the ritual. The air reeked of iron and damp cloth, heavy with the sound of muffled sobs that grew weaker with each passing hour. Even when the chamber stood empty, the weight of suffering clung to it, as if the reversal had bent not only bodies but the room itself, twisting it into a place that no longer belonged to the world above. What made the chamber most haunting was the logic behind it. The Turners did not see cruelty when they looked at those inverted bodies. They saw discipline, order, and the fulfillment of a philosophy that denied the natural state of life. They convinced themselves that by inverting children, they were aligning them with a higher truth, purging them of weakness. Their reasoning was not madness in their eyes. It was devotion disguised as science, science disguised as faith. And so the chamber became a mirror of their own minds, where cruelty and righteousness were indistinguishable. Above ground, the farmhouse remained still, the orchard thrived, and the townsfolk continued to praise the Turners for their kindness. No one imagined that beneath the soil, children were being turned upside down until their bodies collapsed from within, their deaths recorded as corrections instead of crimes. The chamber waited in silence after each offering, the hooks swaying slightly in the still air, as if the room itself remembered the weight of every body that had hung there. And as Thomas closed each entry in his ledger, he convinced himself that the chamber was not a place of death, but of transformation. Yet what truly transformed was not the children but the soil above, which absorbed the suffering until the entire farm became complicated, bearing fruit from the roots of bodies that had been drained in the name of order. The Turner farm was filled with the tools of ordinary labor. To a visitor, the barn and sheds seemed no different from any others in the county. Plows leaned against walls, augers hung on hooks, scythes rested where the grass had been cut. But beneath the surface of this normalcy, the Turners had remade these implements into instruments of cruelty, shaping them not for harvest, but for torment. Each tool carried a hidden purpose, each blade and handle twisted into something that blurred the line between work and ritual. Thomas had a gift for reshaping metal. He spent nights in the barn, the hiss of fire and the ring of hammer against iron echoing across the fields. Neighbors assumed he was repairing equipment, keeping his farm in good order. In truth, he was crafting devices no farmer should ever need. Augers once used to bore into wood were bent and welded into cradles where children could be placed, their bodies forced into curves until bones threatened to snap. Plow blades were sharpened not to cut soil but to hold wrists and ankles in place, their edges biting into flesh whenever a child struggled. The very tools that once promised life from the earth became the scaffolding of death. Some instruments were made to look harmless until used. Chains woven with straw to resemble rope were looped around children's arms, cutting deep grooves when tightened. Wooden yokes, the kind once placed on oxen, were refashioned to fit the shoulders of children, forcing them to crawl on hands and knees like beasts of burden. Even spoons and ladles from the kitchen were altered, their bowls filed into sharp curves, their handles twisted into hooks. Hannah carried them into the cellar as if she were bringing utensils for a meal, disguising horror as household duty. Each device carried meaning beyond its pain. Thomas wrote in his ledgers that the implements symbolized authority, that by reshaping tools of labor into tools of punishment, he was declaring dominion over both field and flesh. He believed that just as a plow could break the ground to yield crops, so too could his instruments break the body to yield obedience. The farm itself became an extension of his philosophy, every object on it part of the same cruel order. The children were not simply confined or punished, they were harvested, their suffering drawn out with the same patience used to tend soil. Hannah's role was quieter but no less chilling. She carried the devices with reverence, setting them in place as though preparing an altar. She whispered prayers over them, asking for strength, for purity, for the erasure of sin. In her mind, the instruments were not symbols of cruelty but sacred tools, each one sanctified by the suffering it created. She touched them with care, wiping away blood as though she were polishing silver, her devotion sealing the horror in a calm ritual. The cellar soon filled with these creations, each chamber equipped with its own set of instruments. The glass chamber held frames of iron that pressed children against mirrors, their faces forced to meet their own distorted reflections. The silence room carried padded restraints that clamped mouths shut, turning every breath into suffocation. In the chamber of reversal, the hooks were fitted with harnesses built from leather and plow steel, designed to keep bodies inverted long after life had fled. Each tool fit seamlessly into the turner's system, as if cruelty itself required an arsenal to thrive. What made these instruments most terrifying was how ordinary they appeared when seen apart from their purpose. To anyone else, they were scraps of farm life, rusted metal and worn wood. But in the cellar they became extensions of the turner's will, proof of their authority over life and death. The children who encountered them knew their meaning instantly. The weight of the iron, the edge of the blade, the cold of the chain, all spoke of suffering that could not be escaped. Each instrument carried its own silence, its own memory of what it had done. Above ground, the farm continued to look like any other. Neighbors borrowed tools, never suspecting what other creations lay hidden beneath the barn floor. The Turners smiled, lent a shovel, offered a blade, all while knowing that in their cellar sat devices no neighbor could imagine, no church could bless, no law could name. They were not just tools, they were monuments of cruelty shaped by hands that hid evil behind the mask of normal life. And as the orchard grew heavy with fruit, the cellar below remained heavy with iron, its instruments waiting for the next child delivered into the turner's care. In the depths of the Turner cellar, where air carried the damp heaviness of soil and stone, there lived for a time a boy who refused to vanish quietly. He had no name in the ledgers, only a number scrawled in Thomas Turner's neat hand, but in the shadows he gave himself a voice that could not be silenced. The boy found soot where candles had blackened stone, and with trembling fingers he began to leave markings on the walls. At first they were simple scratches, lines of desperation, but soon they grew into something more. An accidental record, the only testimony ever left from a child within those chambers. The boy's body weakened under the punishments, yet his will bent toward expression. He dragged his fingernails across the walls until they tore and bled, leaving grooves that caught soot and ash from the lamps. With these fragments, he shaped symbols, crude drawings, and numbers that only he understood. They were not written for the Turners, nor for the town above, but for himself, a way to hold on to identity when everything else was stripped away. Each mark was a declaration that he had endured another day, another torment, another descent into cruelty. As the days passed, his markings grew more deliberate. In one corner, he drew circles inside circles, each smaller than the last, representing the chambers he had been forced into. The glass room where his screams came back multiplied, the silence room where his breath alone betrayed him, the reversal chamber where his vision blurred with blood. In another place, he etched lines that resembled shackles, crosses that stood for the hooks, and jagged strokes that seemed to describe the pain of blades pressed against his skin. His wall became a map of horror, a sequence of symbols that told the story the Turners would never write in their ledgers. He used his own body as ink when soot ran thin. Fingernails chipped, he carved until the walls bore grooves deep enough to cut his skin. With the blood that welled, he traced words half-formed, prayers distorted into pleas. Sometimes he marked numbers, counting days, though hunger made time unreliable. Other times he drew figures bent and broken, limbs twisted in unnatural positions that reflected the arrangements of the orchard above. His writing was not clear, not orderly, but it carried the weight of truth, the voice of a child forced into silence who refused to vanish without leaving proof. Hannah sometimes noticed the soot on his hands, the black beneath his fingernails, but she mistook it for filth. To her, he was another lamb waiting to be drained by ritual. She never read the walls. Thomas, meticulous in his ledgers, saw the markings once and dismissed them as meaningless scratches of a mind collapsing. Yet those scratches spoke louder than his perfect handwriting. They revealed what Thomas's numbers concealed: the terror, the sequence, the humanity of a child who clung to expression in the face of erasure. The boy did not survive. His final scrawls weakened, his symbols collapsing into smears. The last marks were shallow, drawn by fingers that no longer carried strength. They looked like fading breath, unfinished circles trailing into nothing. When his body failed, the Turners carried him away as they did all others, but the walls remained. His testimony endured not in flesh, but in soot and blood pressed into stone. Years later, when fragments of the cellar were uncovered, faint traces of these markings were still visible. Investigators who entered the ruins did not understand them at first. They taught them the idle scratches of confinement. But when studied together, they revealed a story told not with words, but with desperate invention. A record of punishment, of chambers, of ritual cruelty. It was not the captors who confessed, but a child who refused to let his suffering be forgotten. The Turners had tried to reduce him to a number, a line in a ledger, a specimen erased into silence, but his wall spoke against them, whispering through the years that what was done in secrecy would not remain hidden forever. His ash-carved testimony proved that even in the darkest chambers where identity was stripped and life dismantled, the human will to leave a mark could defy even the most methodical cruelty. It began with smoke rising above the fields, a thick black column that curled against the sky like a warning no one could ignore. The Turner farmhouse, so long silent and impenetrable, was suddenly swallowed by fire. Neighbors ran from distant farms, buckets in hand, but by the time they reached the edge of the lane, the flames had already consumed the roof, sending sparks into the orchard. The house crackled with a violence that suggested more than an accident. The wood burned hot, as if soaked in something that fed the flames from within. For the first time in years, the shutters were forced open, not by hands but by fire, and what lay inside was revealed only for a moment before turning to ash. The townsfolk stood helpless, watching the house collapse inward. They told themselves the Turners must still be inside. Their quiet lives ended in an inferno too fierce for escape. Some said it was judgment, others whispered of misfortune, but all agreed that nothing could survive such heat. When the flames finally weakened, when the walls had fallen into blackened heaps, the people sifted through the wreckage in search of truth. What they found deepened the silence rather than breaking it. Among the charred remains lay fragments. Shards of glass melted into warped shapes, iron hooks twisted by heat, and ledgers half burned but still bearing faint marks of Thomas Turner's hand. The people who searched the ashes expected bodies. They expected to find the family who had lived in that house, their remains blackened but still recognizable. Instead, there was nothing. No bones of Thomas, no trace of Hannah, no remains of the children the town believed had been raised there. The fire had left fragments of structure, fragments of tools, but no human shape. It was as though the blaze had devoured not only wood and stone, but flesh itself. Whispers spread quickly. Some insisted the Turners had perished so completely that nothing remained, that the fire had reduced their bones to dust. But others noticed details that told a different story. In the orchard, soil was freshly disturbed, as though dug not long before the fire began. In the cellar, or what was left of it, there were impressions on the ground that suggested bodies had been moved. The ledgers that survived carried their own hints, entries that ended abruptly, not with death recorded but with empty columns awaiting completion. It was as if the fire had been set to close the book, to erase not only the family but the evidence of what had happened within their walls. Some neighbors claimed they saw figures in the distance on the night of the fire, shadows slipping away across the fields while the blaze consumed the house. Others dismissed these as stories born of fear, yet the absence of bodies could not be explained. The county declared the Turners dead, held a small service in their memory, and marked the ruins as a place of tragedy. But beneath the polite words of prayer, suspicion spread like a second fire. People asked where the children were, why their bones were not among the ashes, why no cries had been heard as the flames raged. There were no answers, only silence. For years, the blackened remains of the Turner farm stood as a scar on the landscape. The orchard grew wild, its branches tangled, its fruit falling unpicked to the ground. The cellar filled with water from rains, drowning what had once been chambers of torment. But the absence of bones haunted the county. Some believed the Turners had fled, carrying their secrets with them into another place, ready to begin again. Others believed the fire was an offering, a final ritual to conceal the evidence of countless lives erased. What remained certain was that the fire revealed nothing. Instead of clarity, it left only doubt. And so the story of the Turner family did not end with the flames. It lingered in questions that could not be answered, in ruins that refused to tell their truth. The fire did not expose their crimes. It buried them deeper, replacing horror with uncertainty, leaving behind a silence that was heavier than any confession. In the end, the only certainty was that the children who had vanished into that house never reappeared in its ashes. Their absence was more haunting than bones. Their erasure was complete yet undeniable, a void that whispered of evil hidden too deep for fire to destroy. Decades passed before the Turner name was spoken again with more than a whisper. The farm had long since rotted into ruin, its orchard overtaken by weeds, its cellar drowned in water and mud. The county had moved on, burying the memory of the fire beneath newer tragedies, newer shames. Yet silence is never permanent. The past finds its way back when least expected. And for the Turners, it returns through paper rather than bone. An old trunk was discovered in the attic of a distant relative's home, heavy with dust and bound shut by rusted clasps. Inside lay journals, their leather covers cracked, their pages yellowed but intact. These were not ledgers of crops or weather, nor diaries of daily life. They were the hidden writings of Thomas and Hannah Turner, the words they had carried with them, preserved as if waiting to be found. The journals revealed what the fire had failed to erase. The handwriting was neat, controlled, never hurried. Thomas filled pages with descriptions of his experiments, not as confessions but as instructions. Each line a manual of suffering written with scientific detachment. He explained his methods as though he were teaching others, detailing how long a body could endure inversion before collapse, how silence stripped identity faster than pain, and how starvation was most effective when paired with prayer. There was no madness in his tone, no frantic scrawl of obsession. It was calm, structured, and methodical. He did not see himself as cruel. He saw himself as enlightened, a man who had uncovered truths hidden from ordinary minds. Hannah's entries were different, yet equally chilling. Where Thomas wrote like a scientist, she wrote like a disciple. Her pages were filled with prayers she composed herself, hymns that turned torment into devotion. She described her role not as executioner, but as midwife of souls, delivering children from flesh to salvation. She recorded her favorite prayers in full, each word dripping with faith twisted into justification. Each hollow rib is a psalm, she wrote. Each dry tongue is a hymn. To read her words was to step into the mind of a woman who had disguised murder as ministry. The journals revealed not only what the Turners had done, but why they believed it was righteous. Thomas wrote of order, of discipline as the highest law. He called the children disordered matter, claiming their suffering purified them. Hannah wrote of sacrifice, of offering lambs to heaven through hunger and silence. Together their words wove a doctrine, a philosophy of cruelty dressed in the garments of salvation. It was not the rambling of lunatics, but the cold structure of people who believed evil was virtue. What made the discovery unbearable was the detail. Each entry recorded not just methods but outcomes. Numbers tracked endurance. Diagrams showed positions of bodies. Notes compared the growth of orchard trees to the burial arrangements beneath them. It was proof that the Turners had seen their cruelty not as crime, but as achievement. They preserved their findings with pride, hoping their work would be remembered. The journals were not apologies. They were legacies. For the county, the discovery reopened wounds never healed. Families who had once delivered children to the Turner farm read in horror that those children had not been raised in safety but dismantled in ritual. The silence of decades collapsed under the weight of words that revealed every lie. Officials who had signed papers of relief, neighbors who had praised the Turners for kindness, all found themselves implicated by neglect. The journals showed how easily cruelty had thrived under the cover of charity, how methodical evil had hidden in plain sight because no one had dared to look too closely. When the writings were studied, scholars debated whether the Turners were religious fanatics, scientific sadists, or something more unsettling, a marriage of both. But the truth was simpler. They were ordinary people who had chosen cruelty with calm intention, who had turned tools of daily life into instruments of torment, who had written their horrors in the same steady hand used to sign church registers. That ordinariness made their words heavier than madness could. Madness can be dismissed. Order cannot. The journals proved that evil does not always shout. Sometimes it writes neatly, prays softly, and waits quietly for someone to turn a page. In the years after the journals were uncovered, the county could no longer pretend the Turner farm had been an accident lost to fire. The details were undeniable, the names missing, the numbers written in ledgers too precise to dismiss. Officials who once praised the Turners now stood in chambers passing new laws, demanding that every orphan be recorded with proof of life, with signatures that could not vanish into paper alone. Registers were tightened, oversight created, rules carved into the system as if to build a fence against the possibility of another Turner family. Yet fences do not erase the ground they stand on. A memorial was raised at the edge of the former orchard, a stone slab where weeds now tangled around broken rows of trees. It stood not to honor but to acknowledge, yet it carried no names, for there were none to carve. The children had been erased too thoroughly, their identities lost in the silence of the cellar and the secrecy of ledgers. The stone bore only an inscription, "For the lost." It was not enough. The air around it always seemed unsettled, as if the ground beneath whispered that memory without names is not memory at all, but another layer of forgetting. The townsfolk carried their own silence as legacy. Families who had once delivered children into the Turners' care said little, ashamed of their relief at letting go, terrified of admitting how easily they had trusted kindness without proof. The county itself became complicit, a community bound not just by tragedy but by the choice to look away when questions should have been asked. The evil of the Turners had thrived not only in their cellar but in the silence of those around them. Silence that smoothed over suspicion, silence that allowed cruelty to grow into ritual. Whispers lingered long after the laws were passed and the memorial built. People said the Turners had not died in the fire, that their work continued in hidden corners of other counties. That cruelty so deliberate could never end in flames. Others believed the orchard still fed on its buried roots. That fruit taken from those trees carried the taste of bones. Whether these whispers were truth or fear, they revealed the same wound. Society had failed to see, and in that failure lay the possibility of repetition. The Turners were gone, but the silence that birthed them remained.